EDF4004, we are very lucky because we have Kitty Jansen here with us to tell us a little bit more about VCE, particularly as she was a former VCE biology teacher and also a VCE assessor. So I thought it would be good. Kitty will tell you a little bit more about her, but she's actually works here at Monash, and you will probably know her from her role as literacy and numeracy advisor. But she's going to tell us kind of the teacher perspective in regards to what are certain things that you might need to know being a VCE teacher.
Yeah, well, you've said it all,
Okay,
really.
all right.
So we'll move right along.
So tell me a little bit about VCE.
So VCE is what you do generally in year 11 and 12, although some students start it in year 10. Students, in order to complete VCE, students have to do 16 units. And 8 of those units have to be Unit 3 and 4, but in the same year. So you can't do Unit 3 one year and then do the Unit 4 the year after. So, however, you don't have to do all 4 of the Unit 3 and 4s in the same year. So you could do a Unit 3-4 in year 11 and then 3 Unit 3-4s in year 12. But you can do 5 Unit 3-4s and only 3 Unit 1s and 2s. So most students will do multiples. They will do more than 16 units because that allows them to pick and choose which, if they signed up for 5 and then halfway through the year they decide they really don't like chemistry or biology or psychology, then they can drop 1 and it's not going to hurt them too much. The other benefit of doing more is that for your 5th year 12 subject, you get extra points, bonus points. So they will take your top 4 scores and then they'll give you a percentage of the others, almost like as a bonus. So it's no point doing extra subjects if you're going to be really under the pump and really stressed because of those extra subjects. But if you happen to have a 5th subject or a 6th subject, then that does bump your scores up. So yeah, many schools are now saying, okay, do 1 year 11 subject or Unit 1 and 2 in year 10, and then you do 3 year 11 subjects, or 3 1s and 2s in year 11 and 1 year 12 one. So they stagger it so that in your...
So are you saying that schools are now just completely scheduling things around an assessment? Is that what you're telling me?
Yes. Definitely. No, but but the other thing that we need to know is that VCE, you can do some other subjects like vet in schools, and they can count as well, sometimes as a scored subject, sometimes not. So that if it's not a scored subject, it will be one of those 5th subjects where you just get a percentage. So you might decide, oh, well, I'll do, if you're going to go into the sciences, I'll do a vet in schools, which is how to be a laboratory technician or something like that, which will then count as a 5th subject. Or people who are doing the arts, they might do a vet in schools lighting of a stage set or something like that, or music, and then they do a VCE music as well as one of their subjects.
Right. So how do you know what to teach?
Well, I'm going to use biology as an example because that's what I'm familiar with, but basically every subject has a study design. And so this is the biology study design, and as you can tell, it's got everything. It's got all the content in it that you need, and it's got your assessment requirements.
And this is on the VCAA website. Is that
That's
correct?
right. Yeah. So even if you just Google study design biology VCAA, it will come up with this. Now this is your Bible. Nothing. These are the rules. When you sit as an examiner in moderation, and everybody is saying, oh, that's, that question should be answered this way, blah, blah, blah. The final thing will always be, well, in the study design, it said this. So if it didn't say cover this in the study design, then they can't expect to ask a question of it. And then sometimes they end up giving away free marks because it wasn't in the study design. So the textbook that you might use, etc., uses that same study design, but you have to trust that the authors did the right thing. So I've been in examination things where people have said, yes, but in the textbook that's down as an optional. Well, no, if it was in the study design, it's in the study design. They don't care what the textbook did.
Okay. Interesting. So how did you know what to do for the SAC? Because this is kind of, I don't have a background in VCE, so that was one of the reasons why I was really interested to get Kitty's perspective, because I don't actually know the ins and outs, but I do know people talk a lot about having the VCE, but then you have the SACs and there's this relationship, and as teachers you need to understand that relationship. So first of all, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so in biology, and this is not the same for every subject, so in the study design it will tell you how it's going to be assessed. And in biology it's an exam, which is worth 60%, and school assessed coursework, which is worth 40%. So you obviously have to get the students ready for the exam, and we'll talk about that afterwards. But in terms of what to do for the school assessed coursework, which is SAC, the study design tells you what you need to assess. Now, different schools have different policies around SACs. So sometimes the school will say, well, we've already decided, or the head of the department has decided what SACs you're going to do, because there might be 2 or 3 teachers all teaching the same thing, and everybody has to do the same within the one school, because the SACs are moderated within the school and with others.
And are they like, could they be old ones, or are they new every year?
No, they can be old ones.
Okay.
However, usually every 3 or 4 years, the study design is updated, so then the SACs have to be updated. Now, so the school determines the SAC, and if you're the only one teaching it, you determine the SAC. But you can buy SACs online from private companies that say, well, if you do this SAC, we know that it meets the standards.
Well,
so
none of my students would need to do that, because they know all about construction of tests.
The thing about SACs that is really important to know is the SAC scores that people get have to be standardized. So once the students sit the exam, they don't just take the teacher's word for it, because I might be a really difficult teacher, or somebody who is at a high achieving school where everybody, to get an A, the teacher wants to make it really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you might go to another school where it's not as high achieving, and so the teacher wants everybody to have a chance at getting an A. Most people still wouldn't, but the person who got the A there, if they went to the high achieving school, might only get a B. So somehow they have to standardize them. So what they do is they ask you for your list of SAC results. And then they compare that, and this is my understanding, I'm not 100% sure on this, but my understanding is they then compare that to the school's GAT score, which everybody sits, which is a separate test, nothing to do with your subject area, and to the exam results. So if I have given a student an A for a SAC, but then they get a B in the exam, their A gets lowered, if that's the case for everyone. Now, my understanding is that it's really important that teachers try to get the order of who they think will do the best for the exam in a similar order to the SAC. So the closer those two are, the better the logarithm or the algorithm works. So now sometimes this is at odds with school policy, because say for example the place I worked at last, which was at TAFE, the students, we had a policy that if you handed your SAC in a day late, you would get 10% deducted, and etc. So, or if you weren't there during the SAC and you didn't have a medical certificate, you wouldn't get a mark, which meant that some students who were lazy but really good high achievers, or would do well in the exam, got say a D for their SAC result, but then got an A in their exam, which then threw the algorithm out. So you have to be, although you might, and I'm not saying be dodgy and check this with your school, but if your school has a policy like that, just check that it doesn't affect the order of, the students who are likely to do well on the exam. And sometimes what I would do is I checked with my head of department, and I would tell the students that they didn't get graded, but I still gave them the grade that they would have gotten, because I didn't want them to be penalized. Now, one time, one of these students then didn't bother showing up for the exam, so that threw everything out as well. So it's it's an algorithm that's really complicated, and I don't think many people fully understand it. But it's really important that your SAC results reflect how well you think the students do on an exam.
And I think that word reflect is important, because you gave me an example the other day about like someone who might be quite religious and so they won't. Can you give that example?
So I had a biology teacher as a colleague who said she was really in dilemmas because she had an A+ student who was a really hard worker, etc., who got A's on all her SACs and would do really well on the exam, but she was very Christian and she refused to answer any questions on evolution, which was maybe 5% of the exam, the evolution questions. So the teacher,
and that was just her kind of
protest.
Personal protest.
Yeah. So she said, "I'm not answering any questions on evolution." So she, so that was, they could get around that in the SAC because they didn't have to have a SAC on evolution. So her SAC result was an A+, but the teacher knew that she couldn't possibly get an A+ in the exam because she wasn't going to answer those. So the teacher actually put her down in the order of SACs in order to reflect that, because otherwise, if she had put that person number 1 in her SACs and then she came number 3 in the exam, it would bring everybody's results down.
So it scales down. And there's something on Moodle that talks about scaling, which is quite complex, but I think that's really interesting because obviously the student's quite, and if the student had taken the exam, they may have, without those questions, they may have done well, but knowing that she wouldn't be answering 5%. Obviously, her score is going to come down. So it's understanding that relationship.
But also, it's important. I always made sure that one of my SACs was a test in a test conditions, because some students will be A students and really great at their work, but when they hit the exam, they suffer from anxiety, for example, and they just go blank and they can't do it. So I've had students who I would give A's in their SACs, but then when they did an exam type thing, they would get a C. So you want to have at least one SAC that gives you an inkling on how that student is going to perform on the day. And then because they might not do that well on that particular SAC, that brings their ranking down in the class. And there'd be somebody else who's not great at SACs who then, but just for some reason gets the questions. Because we'll talk about the exam in a minute, but the questions in the exam when they're assessing, they're not just assessing your knowledge. They're not assessing how conscientious you are at getting to class on time or handing things in. They're assessing your ability to apply that information in that context of the question, and some people really struggle with that.
So I think that was an important thing that you said, that going back to that reflection, that the SACs reflect the exam because they need actually preparation in exam kind of conditions. And that gives you kind of an idea, and much easier to kind of then align the SACs with the VCE, because then you're not kind of ruining that algorithm, because that could really affect the whole class if you do that.
Yeah, and that sometimes that might so there's again, I'm not sure exactly how it works, and I wouldn't want to lead people astray, but just know there is a relationship with the SAC results that you hand in to the exam results, and it's probably worth looking into if you're in that situation.
In that scaling document, you can see that it does show that kind of, that the exam score is very much like, for them, there's much more validity in that score. So they will take the validity of that score over the SAC. So I think that algorithm takes that into consideration, so that if there is something out kind of in the SACs, they'll take the validity of the test over that. So it does kind of...
so it means that somebody can sit exactly the same test, and depending on what school they come from and how well the SACs, because the SAC is 40% of the mark, that person might not get the same score as the person who sat next to them who did exactly the same exam, who came from a different school. By the way, I've just noticed on the slide it should say algorithm, not logarithm. But anyway.
That's okay.
All right, so this is an example of the SAC as what they said you have to do for year 12 biology. So for outcome 1, they had to write a report that related to 2 practical activities at least. And for outcome 2, they wanted one of these. And this is where I I didn't say a report or a graphic. And this is a new study design. I don't see a test here, but what they could do is you could do the data analysis or actually a response to a set of structured questions. You could do that under test conditions. So, but you don't have to do only one task. You can do 2 tasks or 3 tasks. So there's a minimum of 2 SACs for this, and this is for Unit 3. And as you can see at the bottom, school assessed coursework for Unit 3 contributes 16% to the overall score.
All right. So how did you prepare your students for the end of your exam?
So as I said before, it's more than just them knowing the content. It's not just knowing that 1 + 1 is 2. It's then being able to read the question that says, well, if one person did this and another person was there, how many people were there? You know, to be able to actually interpret that the question is asking them to do one. I'm using a maths example, but so in biology, for example, it's not always as simple. You have to be able to recognize things like the diagrams, which are often very similar, but not quite the same as the book. So I found that the best way to get students used to that sort of questioning is to give them lots of past paper questions, and then to put them in situations where they have to sit in exam conditions and, you know, perform on the day. So do a simulation, so really put them under the pump, and lots of past paper questions, because the more that they see that sort of wording, the way that the questions are asked, the easier it is for them to apply the knowledge. So they have to have the knowledge, but they also have to know how to use that knowledge. And I think on the next one, this is the past paper examinations are all available online. So if you go to this website and you type in biology, or, you know, it gives you all the biology exams that are available, plus the reports on how people did. So it gives you the answers to those past papers, but also the examiner's report that says the correct answer was this because of this, and many students did this wrong, they misunderstood that. So you can use that information to then, when you're going through the questions with them, to say, now if you said this is because you're thinking about that, which it's not, you know, like, so it gives you some really valuable information. So that's a key. So when I first started teaching VCE biology, I printed off all the exams and the answers, and then I did, you know, literally cut and paste and just put all the questions in piles of, you know, this is an evolution question, this is a cell biology question, and then whatever topic I did, I would say, okay, well, I've got 20 cell biology questions, here are 5 or here are 10, and then I would pull them out later for simulated exams and mix them all up, but so that they really, and a lot of the questions sort of get repeated in some ways. So, and then I would go through it with them. I think we're on to the next slide.
So, did you have a structure to your lesson? So how did you actually, once you figured out all that you needed to do, how did you actually structure your lessons?
Yeah, so I actually put together a timeline, and worked out that because I was working at TAFE, we had 4-hour classes in one session, so only once a week for 4 hours. So we had 32 lessons, and at that stage we had, I think it was 10 SACs to do in that time. So that left us with only 22 lessons that were, you know, sort of unencumbered. And then 2 of those lessons had to be for revision at the end. So really we had 20 lessons left to cover the whole textbook. So then it was just a matter of going, well, this chapter, I think there were 18 chapters. So we had 2 lessons leeway of not having to cover one particular chapter. So I would start every lesson with going through the homework, which was past paper questions. Then I would introduce new materials, and I would do that in a fairly sort of chalk and talk, asking lots of questions. Well, what did we say about this? To really try to involve the students, but also have the odd video, have a story, bring in analogies. And then a lot of my students were not English speaking, so they they understood, but they couldn't. They wanted to see all the words written properly to get the spelling right, and to. So then I would go through all of it again, but this time with a PowerPoint and making sure that I, had covered everything in my more. So without the interruptions of the questions and the answers. So my idea was that they would sort of not necessarily take notes in that first one, but just sort of get it and understand the concept. And then we would go through the nitty-gritty detail with the PowerPoint, and they would write notes and do all that. And at some point also, usually at the PowerPoint stage, I would say, now if you're struggling with this, you don't need to know this. This is for the people who really want to get an A. And if you're sort of aiming for a C, or then don't worry about this bit. This is sort of the nice to have. So that allowed some differentiation as students to go, okay, well, I'm already struggling with the basics. So identify what is the key content, and then what are the sort of bonus extra bits. And then I would set the homework, which would be more past paper questions about what we just did. So the following week, we would go through those past paper questions again. That would be sort of the revision of what we'd done. If I saw that a lot of people didn't quite get it, I'd go through it again, or I'd refer them. The other thing that we did, because it was a 4-hour lesson, is a lot of the lessons were on YouTube. So if you Google, and my husband actually made them, but if you Google VCE biology YouTubes or whatever, there's a whole bunch on them. And there's another guy who did the flipped classroom. He made a whole bunch of podcasts that people still listen to, Douchy. And he was sort of the first one to try and get this flipped classroom, so that but we found the flipped classroom didn't work. So do you know, I don't know, so the flipped classroom didn't work because some students wouldn't do it. Yeah. And then, so I didn't rely on it, but
are you saying that some of these students won't be watching this video?
Yes. But they won't know because they're not watching. But yeah, so basically you can't rely on students, or I couldn't rely on students doing it, because I'd have half of them not doing the homework. If they didn't do their past paper questions, that's fine. They would still get the run through. If they didn't get it, sorry, go home and try it again. Here are the answers. But so having some a YouTube on the topic, whether it's one you make yourself or one that explains it all by somebody else, is a really good way of students to, especially if they miss a class, that you can say, well, this YouTube is connected with that, so that they have it. Now, we had it on Moodle because we had a similar system. Each school will have their own mechanism of intranet or whatever, so you can put it up there.
Okay. So why didn't you do any activities to facilitate their learning?
Well, I would argue that I did, but no, I didn't do many, let's cut things out and, hands-on learning, that sort of stuff, mainly because of time. There just wasn't enough time. And when asked, students preferred to say, just give us all the work and we can work it out and we can ask questions. And so my activities were much more centered around that sort of instructional questioning, that sort of thing, to try and get them to work with the information. I did sometimes make a SAC. That was an activity, so that way it wasn't sort of wasted time. But most students just wanted to walk away with a set of notes. And because we only really had 20 lessons, if you spend an hour or 2 hours out of 4 on doing some activity which is nice and feel good and etc., a lot of students were like, I'd rather just get the information. So I saw my job as giving the students the tools that they could then go home and study for themselves. It's hard. You have to strike you have to strike a balance. I found the students were able to stay motivated for the 4 hours, because I would be really energetic and jumping up and down and sort of making an active lesson without them having to.
Well, now obviously they're motivated because they want to do well on the test. So
that's right.
Or the exam, so they're gonna,
Yeah. So it's only when it's certain learning things like mitosis was difficult, and that's when I made a mitosis SAC, so that they would video doing the chromosomes with pipe cleaners and and take photos and show me. and then I'd go, oh no, that's the incorrect sequence, and but I would make it a SAC rather than just an optional activity, because a lot of the students also, when they realized it was an optional activity, they would leave.
Yeah. Oh, fair enough. So tell me about timeline or schedule.
So I always gave them a really detailed timeline, because I wanted them to know that we only really had 20 weeks. One time I had the student coming to me, and she said, oh, I'm going to miss the first week because I'm going to a concert that I've already booked. But that's okay, because the first week's always introduction, isn't it? And it's like, no, the first 15 minutes is introduction, and then it's chapter 1. So by giving them a timeline that was really accurate, and usually not for the whole year, but by semester or by 10-week blocks by term, meant that if a student missed a lesson, they could see what they'd missed and what they had to catch up on. They could see what videos that, what assessment was coming up. They knew exactly when their SAC was going to be, so they could say, sometimes we would change it, because they would say, oh, but that's the same day as the SAC is for chemistry, which was, the lesson before mine. So that would be 4 hours of chemistry SAC, and then, and then a biology SAC. So maybe then we change it. But it allowed them to plan, and it also allowed me to stay on track, because some students, especially the conscientious ones, would go, wait a minute, we were supposed to do that chapter last week and we haven't done it yet. And that was sort of like, oh yes, no, we really have to go faster, because you can't run out of time. There is an exam.
Who decides on the textbook?
It's usually the school. They have already published the reading list before you inherit it. But if you're doing it year after year, you decide, or some teachers decide not to have a textbook, or just, sometimes you get like revision notes. So for me, what I ended up advising was the students who wanted to get an A, they get the big, thick $80 textbook. But the students who were sort of saying, I'm just happy with a pass, or I'm happy to get like a C or a D, I would say, listen, just stick to the revision notes, because then you won't get bogged down in all the detail that you don't necessarily need or want. And then you just know when you get to the exam, there is going to be the odd question that you can't answer. And that's okay, because you're not aiming to answer every single one. You're aiming to answer the one you can, know. So, yeah.
All right. Any tips for future VCE teachers?
Know your study design and know your content. That's really important. That's not always possible, because sometimes you get given a class and it's like you've got a week to prepare and you don't have time to read the whole textbook. But try and stay on top of it. Know the exam questions and how they're being asked, because that's just so important, and how they're being marked. And if you have an opportunity to be a VCE assessor, it's invaluable. It's hard work. But it really shows you the inner workings of how they mark it. So, for example, in biology, they had one where they asked about protein structure, and if they asked about tertiary protein structure, all they wanted for that answer, it'd be, describe tertiary protein structure, and they just wanted to see the word 3-dimensional. That's all. If you had 3-dimensional, tick, you got the mark. So it's really important to read those examiners' reports and know exactly, because in biology you don't have to write full sentences, you don't have to make it look nice in English, you would. So it's really important to know what they're assessing. So be organized, give them the timeline, the timetable, keep it interesting, tie in with what they already know, and be interactive. I encouraged a lot of questioning. I asked them questions, but I also wanted them to ask me questions. And then I would also be prepared to say, I have no idea. So, the students it became a bit of a challenge that they could ask me a question that I had to say, I don't know, or let's Google it. But then we would research it together and find the answer. So, show them that you're just as fallible as they are. You get things wrong sometimes, and that's okay. But so it's okay not to understand. Keep asking questions, and hopefully that keeps them engaged and thinking, and that's, and constructing knowledge. And show them that you care, because it's really
pretty full on, isn't it, for students?
It is. It's full on for them, and I try to always create a bit of a them and us. You know, like those terrible examiners, of which I am not one. But, you know, like try to sort of get them into this mindset of, you know, why are they asking this question this way, and how can you, you know, cheat the system in a way, and how can I help you cheat the system? So that kept them sort of, I think they kept most of them engaged, not all, but most. Anyway.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate that, because that's just things that I'm learning through the process. I appreciate that.
Excellent.
All right. Have a good week.
Okay. Bye.